The Strait of Hormuz functions less like a normal maritime passage and more like a pressure valve for the global economy. At its narrowest point, the channel compresses one of the largest concentrations of energy exports on Earth into a corridor only a few dozen kilometers wide. Tankers carrying crude oil, condensate, and liquefied natural gas move in carefully separated lanes, creating a continuous, fragile flow. Any disruption in this space does not stay local. It radiates outward instantly, first into futures markets, then shipping insurance, then energy pricing, and eventually into inflation, manufacturing costs, and political stability far beyond the Gulf. Because of this structural role, the Strait is not merely important, it is systemic. It connects producers in the Gulf to consumers in Asia, Europe, and beyond, forming a supply artery that cannot be easily rerouted. Alternative pipelines exist, but their capacity is limited. Even under ideal conditions, they cannot compensate for a prolonged closure or militarization. This creates a situation where the strait is simultaneously narrow, vulnerable, and globally indispensable. When a waterway holds this level of importance, militarizing it transforms risk into certainty. Naval deployments, escort missions, surveillance flights, and defensive postures introduce friction into an environment that depends on predictability. Shipping lanes rely on routine, on schedules, on clear rules. Military presence replaces that routine with uncertainty. Tankers must coordinate with multiple authorities. Insurers reassess threat levels. Crews face operational delays, and any unexpected maneuver becomes a potential incident. Even without deliberate aggression, the density of vessels combined with armed patrols increases the probability of miscalculation. A radar lock interpreted as hostile, a drone misidentified, a warning shot misunderstood. These small moments can cascade rapidly. In a narrow corridor, there is little room for error, and escalation compresses just as tightly as geography. The danger is amplified by the layered nature of participation. Once militarization begins, it rarely remains limited to a single actor. Energy importing states feel compelled to protect their shipping. Regional powers deploy forces to signal deterrence. External powers enter to guarantee navigation. The strait gradually becomes crowded not just with tankers, but with overlapping security architectures. Each navy operates under its own rules of engagement. Each command interprets threats differently, and communication between them is often imperfect. This creates a complex environment where no single actor controls the situation, yet all are exposed to the consequences. The more participants involved, the more difficult de-escalation becomes. A confrontation between two vessels can draw in allied forces, triggering chain reactions that extend beyond the original incident. Markets react not to actual disruption, but to perceived risk. The mere announcement of heightened security operations can drive volatility. Traders price in the possibility of closure, insurance premiums increase, and shipping companies demand risk compensation. These costs accumulate quickly. Energy prices rise not because supply has stopped, but because the system anticipates instability. Import-dependent economies feel the pressure first. Manufacturing sectors reliant on steady fuel costs adjust forecasts. Governments begin contingency planning. The psychological dimension becomes as important as the physical one. A militarized choke point introduces uncertainty that spreads through financial systems faster than ships can move. The result is a feedback loop. Increased tension drives price spikes, which raise political stakes, which in turn incentivize stronger military postures, deepening the sense of crisis. Geography compounds this instability. The Strait of Hormuz forces vessels into defined transit corridors, making them highly visible and predictable. Unlike open ocean navigation, ships cannot easily alter course without disrupting traffic patterns. This predictability is useful for monitoring, but it also makes the corridor vulnerable to disruption. Even minor incidents, a damaged vessel, a mechanical failure, a collision, can slow traffic. In a militarized environment, these routine maritime issues take on strategic significance. A stalled tanker becomes a potential blockade. A diverted route becomes a security question. The corridor's narrowness magnifies every event. Operational flexibility disappears, replaced by rigid movement patterns that are easier to monitor but harder to manage during tension. Insurance plays a critical role in this ecosystem. Maritime insurers evaluate risk dynamically, adjusting premiums based on perceived threats. When militarization increases, insurers classify the region as high risk, sometimes requiring additional coverage or refusing standard policies. Shipping companies must either absorb these costs or pass them on. Some operators may avoid the route entirely, reducing available shipping capacity. This constriction further pressures markets as fewer tankers move through the same demand environment. The economics of transit begin to change. What was once routine commerce becomes a calculated gamble, with each voyage assessed against geopolitical conditions. The cumulative effect is reduced efficiency, increased cost, and heightened sensitivity to political developments. Energy supply chains are designed for continuity, not sudden interruption. Refineries schedule deliveries weeks in advance. Storage facilities maintain limited buffers. Power generation and industrial output rely on predictable inflows. When the strait is perceived as unstable, these systems shift into defensive mode. Countries draw down reserves, seek alternative suppliers, and renegotiate contracts. These adjustments are expensive and often inefficient. Long-distance replacements increase transport costs. Spot market purchases inflate prices. Strategic reserves provide temporary relief but signal deeper concern. The global energy system becomes reactive rather than stable, responding to geopolitical signals rather than supply fundamentals. Militarization also alters signaling dynamics. Naval presence is meant to deter disruption, but it simultaneously communicates that disruption is expected. This paradox shapes perceptions. Shipping companies interpret deployments as warnings. Markets interpret them as confirmation of risk. Political actors interpret them as escalation. Even defensive postures can be read as preparation for confrontation. The more visible the military footprint, the stronger the signal that the corridor is contested. This perception alone can reshape behavior, encouraging hedging strategies and cautious routing decisions. The waterway becomes psychologically unstable before any physical disruption occurs. The choke point nature of the strait means that disruptions cannot be easily diversified away. Unlike broader trade networks where alternative routes exist, energy flows through Hormuz are concentrated. Pipelines bypassing the strait exist, but lack sufficient capacity. Expanding them takes years, not weeks. Maritime rerouting around other regions is impractical for Gulf exports. This structural limitation makes the strait uniquely sensitive. Even partial interference affects global balances. The system lacks redundancy, and militarization exposes that weakness. The closer the corridor moves toward confrontation, the more fragile the entire network becomes. Tanker traffic slows, costs rise, risk perceptions intensify, and the global energy system begins to absorb the strain without any formal closure, without any declared blockade, without any definitive moment marking the transition from stability to uncertainty. A multinational mandate in a contested choke point does more than authorize patrols. It redefines the nature of the conflict. What begins as a limited regional tension suddenly acquires institutional backing, shared rules of engagement, and collective obligations. Once multiple states operate under a common authorization, the logic of the situation changes. Any confrontation involving one participant risks implicating the others. The mandate transforms isolated actors into a coordinated presence, and coordination creates commitment. Naval escorts, surveillance missions, and interdiction authorities become collective responsibilities rather than unilateral choices. The conflict, which may have been geographically contained and politically compartmentalized, begins to expand in scope simply because the legal and operational framework now includes multiple powers. The mechanism of escalation in such scenarios is structural rather than deliberate. No single state needs to decide to widen the war. The structure itself pushes events in that direction. A tanker escort becomes a shared mission. An incident involving that escort triggers consultations. Consultations create pressure for a unified response. A unified response requires demonstration of credibility. Credibility demands visible action. Each step follows logically from the previous one, even if none of the participants initially sought confrontation. The multinational mandate acts like a conveyor belt, moving actors forward through procedural necessity. De-escalation becomes harder because backing away requires consensus, while escalation can occur through unilateral interpretation of shared commitments. Participation also alters risk tolerance. A single state operating alone can choose restraint without worrying about alliance credibility. In a coalition, restraint may be interpreted as weakness both internally and externally. Each participant worries about signaling reliability to partners. This encourages firmer postures, stricter enforcement, and lower thresholds for response. The operational environment becomes more rigid. Commanders in the field must consider not only immediate safety but also the political expectations of multiple governments. This multiplies the incentives for assertive behavior. The more actors involved, the more likely someone interprets an ambiguous situation as requiring action. Ambiguity, which might otherwise allow for quiet de-escalation, instead becomes a trigger for coordination. A multinational framework also introduces layered chains of command. Each navy retains national control, yet operates within a shared operational plan. Communication flows horizontally between coalition partners and vertically back to national authorities. This complex structure slows decision-making in some moments and accelerates it in others. A tactical commander may act quickly under standing rules, while political leaders later interpret the action as binding. Alternatively, hesitation at one level may be overridden by urgency at another. The result is inconsistency, where responses are shaped not only by events but by institutional dynamics. In a crowded maritime corridor, such inconsistencies can generate confusion. One force may signal caution while another escalates, creating mixed messages that increase tension. The presence of multiple great powers introduces symbolic competition alongside operational cooperation. Even when states share a mandate, they remain conscious of prestige and influence. Patrol patterns, leadership roles, and command rotations become political questions. Each actor seeks visibility, aiming to demonstrate contribution and capability. This competitive dimension subtly pushes forces toward more assertive behavior. Demonstrations of presence, close escorts, visible drills, aggressive monitoring serve both operational and reputational purposes. Yet each demonstration also raises the perceived level of confrontation. The strait gradually shifts from a transit corridor into a stage where major powers display resolve. The symbolic layer amplifies risk because actions are interpreted not only for safety but for strategic signaling. Legal authorization changes expectations among commercial actors as well. Shipping companies interpret a multinational mandate as confirmation that the region is contested. Instead of reassuring markets, formal intervention often signals that normal conditions no longer apply. Companies demand stronger protection, which in turn requires more active escort operations. Escorts increase the density of naval vessels, raising the probability of interaction with opposing forces. The mandate thus generates operational demand that intensifies the very environment it aims to stabilize. The corridor becomes structured around security convoys, coordinated schedules, and designated lanes. These measures improve control but also reduce flexibility. Any disruption to convoy timing affects multiple ships simultaneously, magnifying consequences. The coalition framework also complicates disengagement. Once forces deploy under a shared mandate, withdrawal carries political costs. Leaving early may be seen as abandoning partners. Remaining indefinitely creates commitment. The operation acquires momentum, extending beyond its initial purpose. Even if tensions ease, participants may maintain presence to avoid appearing uncertain. Over time, the deployment becomes normalized. What began as temporary protection evolves into semi-permanent militarization. The strait remains crowded with naval forces, and each new incident occurs within this entrenched environment. The longer the coalition operates, the more the situation resembles a sustained standoff rather than a temporary precaution. External actors not part of the mandate interpret the coalition differently. They may view it as containment, encirclement, or preparation for broader intervention. These perceptions influence their own posture. Additional patrols, surveillance assets, or defensive deployments appear in response. The corridor becomes layered with opposing presences, each justified as precautionary. Interaction between these forces increases. The multinational mandate, intended to stabilize, ends up multiplying points of contact. Every transit becomes a moment of observation. Every maneuver is watched and interpreted. The density of monitoring reduces surprise but increases sensitivity. Minor deviations attract attention, and attention raises tension. The shift from regional to systemic conflict occurs gradually. At first, the coalition frames its role narrowly, protecting shipping, ensuring navigation. But each new incident invites expansion of authority. Surveillance areas widen. Rules of engagement adjust. Intelligence sharing deepens. The operational map expands beyond the immediate strait to adjacent waters. What began as corridor protection evolves into broader maritime management. The geographic scope of the mission grows, pulling in more assets and extending duration. The conflict's center of gravity moves from local disputes to international coordination. Decisions about patrol routes and escort priorities become geopolitical questions. Diplomatic consequences follow operational ones. States outside the coalition may call for counterbalancing arrangements. Forums for negotiation multiply. The issue shifts from bilateral tension to multilateral dispute. Positions harden because more actors are invested. Compromise becomes difficult as each participant must satisfy domestic audiences and coalition partners. The political stakes rise. A single incident at sea can trigger statements, consultations, and demands across multiple capitals. The conflict's rhythm accelerates, driven by institutional reactions rather than local dynamics. The strait becomes a focal point for broader rivalry, its narrow waters carrying the weight of global competition. Legal and diplomatic momentum often builds quietly through resolutions, draft language, procedural votes, and negotiated mandates that appear technical but carry strategic consequences. Once a proposal for coalition naval intervention enters formal discussion, the process itself begins to shape expectations. Diplomatic language evolves from exploratory consultations to structured proposals. Words like monitoring shift toward protection, then toward enforcement. Each revision subtly expands scope. States that might hesitate to act unilaterally become more comfortable operating under collective authorization. The framework offers legitimacy, distributes responsibility, and reduces political risk for participants. As more actors signal support, the momentum becomes self-reinforcing. Even before any ships deploy, the expectation of deployment starts to influence planning, logistics, and messaging. A veto interrupts this progression at its most critical stage. It prevents the transition from discussion to authorization. Without formal approval, coalition plans remain informal, limited, and politically constrained. Governments that might have contributed assets under a mandate hesitate to participate without legal cover. Military planners cannot rely on shared rules of engagement. Insurance for joint operations becomes uncertain. The absence of authorization keeps potential partners in a holding pattern. Diplomatic conversations continue, but operational execution stalls. The veto does not eliminate interest in intervention. It blocks the institutional pathway that transforms interest into action. This disruption matters because coalitions rely heavily on legal clarity. When multiple navies operate in proximity, they need defined authorities, boarding rights, escort protocols, communication procedures, and thresholds for defensive action. A mandate provides these definitions. Without it, coordination becomes ad hoc. Each participant must rely on national guidelines, which vary in scope and interpretation. This fragmentation discourages deep cooperation. Ships may share information, but joint patrols become rare. Escort missions remain unilateral. The corridor avoids the layered structure that a coalition would create. The veto thus prevents operational integration, keeping deployments loosely connected rather than unified. Diplomatic momentum also influences political narratives. Once a resolution gains traction, leaders begin framing intervention as inevitable. Statements emphasize responsibility to protect shipping, maintain stability, and deter disruption. Domestic audiences hear a narrative of collective action. Expectations rise that governments will contribute. Backtracking from that narrative becomes politically costly. The veto cuts off this narrative before it solidifies. Without authorization, leaders cannot easily justify deployments as part of an international effort. Public messaging shifts from commitment to caution. The tone changes from urgency to deliberation. This rhetorical shift slows the pace of escalation as political leaders avoid locking themselves into promises. Institutional processes amplify momentum because they create deadlines. Draft resolutions circulate with proposed timelines. Consultations lead to scheduled votes. Defense ministries begin contingency planning aligned with these dates. Naval forces prepare for potential deployment windows. Logistics chains move equipment toward staging areas. These preparations generate sunk costs. Once resources are mobilized, there is pressure to follow through. A veto halts this timeline. Preparations lose purpose. Assets remain in place rather than moving forward. The absence of a mandate removes the trigger that would convert planning into action. Momentum dissipates, replaced by uncertainty. The legal dimension also affects rules of engagement. Coalition authorization often includes provisions allowing escorts, inspections, and defensive maneuvers. These provisions formalize the presence of armed vessels in close proximity to commercial traffic. Without such rules, navies must operate conservatively. Escorts become voluntary rather than coordinated. Boarding operations are rare, requiring bilateral consent. Surveillance remains passive. The operational environment stays less intrusive. The veto therefore limits not only participation but also behavior. Even states that deploy independently do so with narrower authorities, reducing the intensity of interaction. Insurance and commercial actors pay close attention to mandates. A formal coalition signals structured protection but also confirms that the region is contested. Companies adjust routing decisions based on both factors. The veto removes the clarity that a mandate would provide. Instead of assuming coordinated escorts, shipping firms rely on routine transit. Risk assessments remain elevated but not transformed. The absence of a coalition keeps commercial expectations closer to normal operations. Convoy systems do not emerge. Traffic continues in dispersed patterns rather than grouped formations. This reduces the density of naval commercial interactions, lowering the probability of incidents. Diplomatic dynamics within potential coalitions are also affected. States differ in appetite for risk. Some prefer limited observation roles, others advocate active enforcement. A mandate forces compromise, blending these preferences into shared language. Once agreed, all participants operate under the same umbrella, even if interpretations vary. The veto prevents this convergence. Divergent preferences remain separate. Some states may conduct symbolic patrols, others avoid deployment entirely. The absence of unity keeps the operational environment fragmented. No single framework dominates the strait. This fragmentation reduces the scale of coordinated presence. The veto also alters signaling toward external actors. A coalition mandate communicates collective resolve. It suggests that interference with shipping will face coordinated response. External actors interpret this as escalation, prompting countermeasures. Additional patrols, surveillance, or defensive deployments appear in reaction. The veto prevents this escalation in signaling. Without a unified coalition, responses appear less coordinated. External actors calibrate their posture accordingly. The strait avoids becoming a space of overt bloc confrontation. Interaction remains cautious, shaped by uncertainty rather than defined opposition. Legal authorization often extends beyond immediate geography. A coalition protecting a choke point may request expanded surveillance areas, intelligence sharing, and logistical hubs. These expansions widen the operational footprint. Air patrols extend beyond the corridor. Support vessels operate in adjacent waters. The presence gradually spreads. The veto stops this expansion at inception. Without mandate-driven planning, such extensions remain hypothetical. The operational map stays narrow. Forces, if deployed, operate independently and with limited reach. The geographic containment of activity reduces overlap and friction. Diplomatic negotiations following a veto shift tone. Instead of coordinating deployment, states explore de-escalatory measures. Proposals focus on communication channels, incident prevention, and confidence building. The absence of authorization encourages alternatives. Dialogue replaces planning. The tempo slows. Even if tensions remain, the process emphasizes management rather than enforcement. This change in emphasis affects expectations across capitals. Military readiness remains, but the focus moves toward avoiding incidents rather than preparing for coordinated action.